Today, we have for you a list of things that you can do to improve your snare drum sound. If you're frustrated with it, if you're not sure where to start, what's going to take you from here to there, this is the one for you. This one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to move through these pretty fast. Not all of these are going to be applicable to you, but chances are you are experiencing one of these things if you're not thrilled with the sound you're getting right now. We're not deep diving on any of these today. We're not even really demonstrating most of them. This is more about identifying issues that you may be experiencing and hopefully you can get into on your own. We have videos in the past about virtually all of these. Here we go. Today we're going to break down snare drum blind spots into three categories: batter head, snare side head, and the wires. We're going to kick things off with the batter head, the thing we look at the most, the thing we spend the most time with. First up, removing all of your muffling before you get into making tuning adjustments. Muffling on the batter head is only going to get in the way and confuse whether or not the thing is in tune with itself, so let's get all of that off of there before we start to experiment. This isn't about using or not using muffling. This is purely about an unencumbered sound so you can really hear what's going on with the head and get it in tune with itself. One of the things that gets in a player's way the most is inconsistent playing of the snare drum head, particularly when it comes to dynamics and the actual strike zone of where you're hitting it. Familiarizing yourself with what sound is generated from each part of the head, as well as different sorts of rim shots, is going to allow you to imagine a sound you want and immediately have access to it. This will also allow you to choose different sounds for different parts of a song if you choose to do that, or break out of old habits to get a different kind of behavior out of your drum whenever you like. Depending on how you're setting your drum up, you may have access to a lot of sounds which will require a lot more consistency in your playing, or you might have a setup where it's largely the same sound. But even in those circumstances, still knowing what you're going to get when you hit it a certain way, both dynamically and in terms of the location, super important. It is incredibly important to take into consideration the music you're making and the space you're going to be making it in when you're choosing how to set up your drum. This means we have to be thinking about how hard we're going to be playing, how loud things feel in that room, how many instruments maybe are even in the band that you're playing in, remembering that you can make adjustments via more or less muffling and also the tuning range of the batter head to compensate for that environment. So making sure that you think about those things, and if at all possible, tune your drum in the playing environment is going to get you where you need to go a lot faster. If, for instance, you meticulously tune your drum playing it very gently for a performance or a rehearsal where you're going to really be swinging for the fences, you're not accounting for what's going to happen to that sound when you move to that much louder dynamic range. Make sure you check in with how you're going to be playing the drum over the course of the tuning process so that you get what you need in the final product. Moving on to the Reso head on the snare drum. Make sure you replace that head. They don't live forever, and just because we're not hitting it and pitting it up and getting it dirty doesn't mean it doesn't wear out. Every single time you hit the batter head, all of that force, all of that air is slamming into the snare side head every single time. You may be hitting just the tip of the stick on the top, but your bottom head, the whole thing is moving every single time. This is not as visible because it's both underneath the drum and also doesn't have really clear damage happening to it that we can see with our eyes, but that doesn't mean it's not getting worn out, and they get worn out, in my experience, much faster than batter heads. My personal move is to mark the snare side head with the date when I changed it, and depending on how much I'm using that drum, I'll change that head between 6 months and a year from then. This affords me assurance that I'm getting the tone that I'm looking for and not slowly losing it and not realizing it over the course of the life of that head. Here at the studio, we end up changing them a lot more often than that because not only are we playing these drums a lot, we're also changing the tuning of the Reso head often for different sounds and different demonstrations. And anytime you're doing that, like if maybe you only own 1 or 2 drums and you have to make changes often, that's going to shorten the life of that head even more to where you might have to change it every month. We've changed 2 in a week before. We've talked plenty in the past about not over cranking your snare side head, particularly when it's brand new. Let's set that aside and talk about range in that head, and particularly checking out that range while leaving the batter head tuning alone and listening to it both with the wires on and off. Sometimes when we think about getting tone out of the snare drum, the wires can get in the way of really hearing what's changing as we modify the tension on the snare side head. Practice listening with the wires off and striking the center of the batter a bunch, play it a whole bunch, in between each very small incremental move on the snare side, and listen for absence of tone or growth of tone as you move lower and higher through its range. One of our favorite things to modify and experiment with is the tension rods that are not adjacent to the snare wires. Again, the ones that are not adjacent to the snare wires. Raising and lowering tension on them has the largest effect on the behavior of the snare wires, assuming that the drum is in tune with itself and we don't have any mechanical issues going on. This is a great way to check out exactly what's going on with your wires and move toward more breathy noise in the wires or a tighter sound without dramatically changing the tone of the rest of the instrument. It's time now to talk about the wires, the unsung hero of the snare drum. First and foremost, they need to be mounted correctly. That means they need to be centered on the head when under tension. That's very important. They need to not be twisted or bent in any way, but straight and aligned. And they very much need to not be resting on the bearing edge. Some wires are longer than others. Some drums are slightly undersized, and we need to keep an eye on this both for the possibility of damage to the bearing edge and also just for the general response of the wires. There are also several mounting methods that we can utilize when putting wires on the drum. Each of them has benefits and drawbacks. None of them are completely terrible, but we need to know what to look out for to make sure that they're optimized. Speaking in generalities, we stay away from plastic straps for a couple of reasons. The main one being that because of the nature of the material, we often run into the wires slapping into the snare side head when they are disengaged, and when we want to use the drum as more of a timbale sound or for different kinds of Latin grooves. This is something that not everybody might think about, and they might even consider that something is wrong with their drum when they turn the wires off, hit a rim shot, and hear them flapping around, when in reality, it's just the plastic straps. On that same token, if you are using straps of any kind and they aren't aligned correctly in the snare butt plate or in the snare mechanism, you can end up with the wires being under more tension on one side of the set and less tension on the other side, resulting in both noisy wire response and also choking at the same time. This is probably the thing I've seen on drums in shops and just in friends' drum sets and practice spaces more than anything else. Misaligned and poorly mounted snare wires, there's nothing you can do to tune that drum up nicely if that's happening. The method that you use to mount your wires is a personal choice, and there's not anything intrinsically wrong with any of them as long as you understand the limitations. But having said that, depending on the style of butt plate and mechanism on the drum, some will be better than others, and in the case of, for instance, vintage Ludwigs like we have, some will be impossible because we literally can't attach a strap to the snare mechanism on this instrument, for instance. It's also worth noting that whatever method of mounting the wires came stock with the drum that you're playing doesn't mean that it's the right one for that drum or for the wires that came with it. Oftentimes, this is where corners will get cut even on pretty nice drums. So we should definitely make sure that we look into that, experiment with it, and find the one that gives the drum the best sound. This one might feel like a no-brainer, but it's worth mentioning. Relax the tension on your snare wires if you are a person who likes it really tight. The thing that we have noticed the most, both in interpersonal relationships with other drummers and also on the internet, is that there is a fundamental idea that more tension means more articulation. That's not absolutely false, but you can't get articulation back in a musical and pleasing way to the ear if the heads are not tuned in a way to give you that in the first place. One of the common things that I hear in drums that I stumble upon, particularly again in stores, is the drum itself is tuned very low and the wires are tensioned incredibly tight. So you end up with the drum that has no sensitivity or snare response at low dynamics, and maybe an okay sound when you hit it as hard as you can, but crazy wild business in the overtones because the tension of the wires is actually pressing on the snare side head and taking it out of tune. These are things that are definitely manageable and fixable if you sit down and understand that the drum's tuning regardless of the style of the instrument, is going to affect the articulation far more than how cranked the wires are. This may seem like three disparate things and also a lot of information, trying to think about the batter head and the snare side and the wires all at once. The fact of the matter is that we parted them out like this so we could talk about each one individually, but every part of the drum, when you make a change, affects the behavior of every other part of the drum. That doesn't mean that you need to be making a million changes every time you make an adjustment. This is about experimentation and understanding what will happen with the wires and the snare side if you pitch the batter up a little bit, or what will happen to the overall sound of the drum if you relax the sound of the snare wires a little bit. We just want to know what's going to happen when we make an adjustment so that if we want to make more adjustments than that, we have a fairly good idea of where it's going to go and ultimately be able to understand how to take this drum from where it is to where we want it to be and back again. The only way to really internalize these things is to experiment. Take the time, set aside any prescriptions or numbers or cheat codes or whatever you might have, and remember that the only way to turn information into knowledge is through spending time with it, experimenting, and internalizing each of these little details so that they can start to become a whole for you and take you into the sound that you're looking for.